Picture this. It's the spring of 845 AD. You're standing on the banks of the Seine River, watching 120 dragon-prowed longships cut through the water like blades through silk. There are 700 Norse warriors on those ships, battle-hardened, fearless, absolutely certain they are about to do something that has never been done before. They're heading for Paris. And here's what makes this moment so terrifying. The most powerful empire in the Western world knows they're coming. The Franks have scouts, they have soldiers, they have walls, but none of it matters, because what happened over the next few weeks would expose something rotting at the very core of the Carolingian Empire, and force a civilization to make a choice that haunts historians to this day. What really happened at the Siege of Paris? The answer is stranger, darker, and more fascinating than anything you've seen in a TV show. Stay with me, because we're going all the way back to the beginning, to understand what made Paris so vulnerable. In 845 AD, you have to understand who was actually running things in Western Europe at the time. We're talking about the Carolingian Empire, the political superstructure that Charlemagne built through decades of brutal, relentless conquest. At its peak, this empire stretched from modern-day France all the way into Germany, Italy, and beyond. It was, by any measure, the dominant force in Europe, the most organized, the most militarized, the most feared. But Charlemagne died in 814 AD. And when great men leave great empires behind, the people who inherit them are almost never equal to the task. His son, Louis the Pious, tried to hold it together. He really did. But Louis had a problem that no amount of military strength could fix. His sons hated each other. 3 of them, specifically. Lothair, Pepin, and Louis the German spent the better part of 2 decades fighting over who would control the empire after their father died. And that internal civil war, that constant fracturing of Frankish political unity, created something extremely dangerous. It created an opening. Think about it in terms you'd recognize today. Imagine the United States government suddenly split into 3 factions, each one commanding a different part of the military, each one pointing their weapons at each other instead of outward. What do you think happens at the borders? That's exactly what the Norse raiders saw. They were expert opportunists. They had been probing the coastlines of England, Ireland, and France for decades, testing defenses, raiding monasteries, learning which kingdoms would fight back hard, and which ones were too busy collapsing from the inside. And by 845 AD, they had their answer about the Franks. The timing was perfect, and what happens next is where things get truly unbelievable. The man who led the 845 raid on Paris has a name that's going to sound familiar to anyone who's ever watched a certain History Channel show. Ragnar, possibly Ragnar Lothbrok himself, though historians will argue about this until the end of time. Here's what we know for certain. A Norse chieftain named Ragnar, referenced in Frankish chronicles as Reginharus, commanded the fleet that sailed up the Seine in March of 845. Whether this is the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, a man named after him, or someone who later had those legends attached to his name, we cannot say with 100% certainty. What we can say is that this man was a tactical genius. When the Frankish king, Charles the Bald, got word that a Norse fleet was pushing upriver toward Paris, he made a decision that military historians still shake their heads over. He split his forces. He divided his army into 2 groups, positioning them on opposite banks of the Seine, thinking he could catch the Norse fleet in a crossfire. Instead, Ragnar attacked one of those divided groups and destroyed it. Then he did something that goes beyond battlefield tactics into pure psychological warfare. He took 111 Frankish prisoners from that first battle, and he hanged them, all of them. on an island in the Seine, in full view of the other Frankish army on the opposite bank. Let that land for a second. He hung 111 men where their own comrades could watch, not just as a display of power, but as an offering. Ragnar was said to be deeply devoted to Odin, the Norse god of war and wisdom. This wasn't random brutality. This was ritual. This was a message. We do not fear your god. We answer to ours. The psychological impact on the Frankish army was immediate and devastating. Morale shattered. Many soldiers deserted. Charles the Bald pulled his remaining forces back rather than risk further confrontation. And on Easter Sunday, of all days, the Norse fleet reached Paris. Hey, quick pause for a second. Did you already know about the 111 prisoners being hanged? Because when I first came across this detail in the Frankish annals, I genuinely stopped and had to reread it twice. Most people who know the general story of the Viking Siege of Paris have no idea this happened. Let me know in the comments. Did that detail surprise you? Because it absolutely floored me when I dug into the primary sources. The city itself wasn't what Paris is today. No Eiffel Tower, obviously. No grand boulevards. In 845 AD, Paris, then called Lutetia, evolved into Mauritius by the Franks, was largely concentrated on the Ile de la Cité, the island in the middle of the Seine. It had walls, yes. It had a cathedral, churches, and a royal palace. But it was not built to hold off 700 Norse warriors who had just annihilated the army sent to stop them. The raiders moved through the city. They looted monasteries. They stripped churches of gold and silver. They burned buildings on the outskirts. And while they did it, Charles the Bald sat on the other side of those walls, watching, calculating, and ultimately deciding that fighting was not the answer. What he did next changed the course of European history. And that moment, the deal he made, the price he paid, is something that almost nobody talks about in the full context it deserves. Stay with me. In fact, millions of people recently went searching for the truth behind Ragnar Lothbrok, after the History Channel's version of events left too many questions unanswered. And today, we're going further than any of those videos dared to go, because here is the part of this story that reframes everything. Charles the Bald paid the Vikings to leave. Not a small amount either. He paid 7,000 pounds of silver, a sum so enormous it was called Danegeld, the Dane payment, and it became one of the most controversial diplomatic decisions in Carolingian history. This was tribute money. Protection money. The most powerful Christian king in Western Europe paid a Norse raider to spare his capital city. Now, before we judge Charles too harshly, and trust me, historians have judged him plenty, it's worth understanding what he was actually facing. His army was broken. His nobles were fighting each other. The church was screaming at him to act but offering nothing in terms of military support. And a disciplined, battle-motivated Norse force was camped inside the most symbolically important city in his kingdom. What would you do? That's not a rhetorical question. I genuinely want you to think about it. Quick question, and I want a real answer in the comments. Was Charles the Bald a pragmatic genius who saved Paris from total destruction, or a coward who set a catastrophic precedent? Team pragmatist or team coward? Drop it below, because the historians are genuinely split on this one, and I want to know where you land. Here's why it matters beyond the immediate moment. That payment, that Danegeld, sent a signal across every Norse settlement from Norway to Denmark. The Franks will pay. And they did. Again and again and again. The 845 raid was followed by more raids. 856, 861, 885. Each time the Norse returned to the Seine with larger fleets, more warriors, and bigger demands. The Danegeld became a recurring cost of Carolingian foreign policy, not a one-time emergency payment, but a structural line item in the imperial budget. But something changed with the raid of 885. And this is where the story pivots in a direction that almost nobody expects. In 885, the Norse came back with somewhere between 300 and 700 ships. The sources vary wildly, but even the conservative estimates describe a fleet so large, it was said to have stretched for 2 miles down the Seine. The Norsemen who arrived that autumn were not Ragnar's raiders. They were led by a chieftain named Sigfrid, and alongside him, a fearsome commander called Rollo, a name that will matter enormously in a few minutes. But this time, Paris didn't fall. Not because the Franks had gotten stronger, not because Charles the Fat, the emperor of the time, yes, that was his actual nickname, Charles the Fat, had managed to hold things together politically. No. Paris survived in 885 because of one man, a single bishop, a churchman who picked up a sword when everyone else ran. His name was Goslin. And what he did during that 11-month siege is one of the most remarkable stories of personal courage in all of medieval history. Stay with me, because what I'm about to share in the next part is something that almost never gets talked about. Goslin was the Bishop of Paris. He was a man of the church, trained in theology, not warfare. His job was prayer, administration, and the spiritual care of his people. But when the Norse fleet arrived in November of 885, and it became clear that no imperial army was coming to save the city, Goslin did something extraordinary. He organized the defense himself. He oversaw the rapid construction of a wooden tower on the main bridge over the Seine, the Grand Pont, designed specifically to prevent the Norse fleet from bypassing Paris and continuing upriver. Think about the strategic logic here. Paris itself was the cork in the bottle. If the Norse could get past the bridges, they could raid the wealthy lands of Burgundy, Champagne, and the Loire Valley with absolute impunity. Goslin understood that holding those bridges wasn't just about saving Paris. It was about saving everything upstream. For 11 months, a garrison of roughly 200 men, 200, held those bridges against a Norse force that numbered in the thousands. Wave after wave of assault. Fire ships sent down the river to burn the wooden tower. Catapults, siege engines. The Norse threw everything they had at that bridge, and the defenders rebuilt it, reinforced it, and held. Goslin himself died during the siege, not in battle, but from illness, exhausted by the physical and mental toll of organizing a defense that everyone told him was impossible. But the men he trained, inspired, and led kept fighting. A Frankish count named Odo, who would later become King of France, took over command and continued to hold. The siege finally ended when Charles the Fat arrived with an imperial army, the moment the Frankish defenders had been praying for. Their emperor, at last, had come to relieve them. And then Charles the Fat did something so stunning, so politically catastrophic, that it effectively ended the Carolingian dynasty. He paid the Norse to leave. Again. He gave them permission to raid Burgundy, his own territory, as part of the deal. And when word got out that the emperor had sacrificed his own people to avoid a battle he had the forces to win, the Frankish nobility had seen enough. Charles the Fat was deposed the following year. Odo of Paris, the count, who had actually defended the city with courage and blood, was elected King of France in his place. Think about what that means. The man who defended Paris with 200 soldiers against thousands of Norse warriors was rewarded with a crown. The man who arrived with an army and paid the enemy to go away lost everything. History, at its best, has a certain brutal justice, and Rollo, the Norse commander who had led some of those 885 raids, didn't disappear either. 26 years later, in 911 AD, Rollo negotiated a remarkable settlement with the Frankish king Charles the Simple. He was given a large swath of northern France in exchange for his baptism, his allegiance to the Frankish crown, and his promise to defend that coastline against future Norse raiders. That land became known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen, and the descendants of Rollo the Viking. They became the Normans, the same Normans who, in 1066, would cross the English Channel and conquer England. The Viking Siege of Paris didn't just test a city, it reshaped the entire political map of medieval Europe. Hey, where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city or state in the comments. I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. Whether you're coming in from New York, Texas, California, somewhere in the South, or across the country, let me know. You'd be surprised how many of you are out there. So what does all of this actually tell us? Because this story is about a lot more than longships and silver payments. What this tells us, first and foremost, is that internal division is always a greater threat than external attack. The Carolingian Empire wasn't destroyed by the Norse. It was softened from within by civil war, political fracture, and the failure of leadership to prioritize the common good over personal ambition. The Norse were opportunists, brilliant, ruthless opportunists, but they walked through a door that the Franks had already left wide open. Second, and this one genuinely moves me, the real lesson here is that institutions are only as strong as the individuals willing to defend them when it costs something. Goslin didn't have to pick up a sword. He was a bishop. He had every theological and political justification to negotiate, retreat, or simply flee. Instead, he chose to stand. 200 men and one determined bishop held a city that an emperor couldn't save. That's not a detail in a history book. That's a statement about what leadership actually looks like under pressure. Third, the Danegeld. Every time Charles the Bald and his successors paid that silver, they were teaching the Norse something that could never be untaught, that the Franks valued comfort over confrontation. And once an adversary learns that about you, the price only ever goes up. That lesson doesn't belong just to 9th century France. It belongs to every negotiation, every conflict, every moment where someone has to decide whether short-term relief is worth the long-term cost. Fourth, Rollo. The man who spent years raiding Frankish lands eventually became the founder of a dynasty that would shape England, the Crusades, and the political structure of medieval Europe. The Vikings didn't just raid history, they became history. And finally, Paris survived. Through incompetent kings and betrayed soldiers and impossible odds, Paris held. Because 200 people decided that their city was worth more than their comfort, their safety, or their lives. That's worth remembering. If this story gave you something, even just one new way of seeing the world, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who deserve to hear stories like this. It takes 2 seconds, and it means everything to a channel like ours. Now I want to hear from you. If you had been Charles the Bald in 845 AD, would you have paid the silver and saved Paris? Or would you have ordered your broken army to fight and risk losing everything? There's no clean answer here, and I genuinely want to know how you'd think through that choice. Drop your answer in the comments below. I personally read every single one, and if you're new here, welcome. Hit that red subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss what we drop next. We cover the stories that history books rushed past, glossed over, or left out entirely. And trust me, You don't want to miss what's coming next. This is Legends Historian, where forgotten stories find their voice. Until next time, stay curious, stay sharp, and never stop asking why.